Shadow wasn't just any horse. He was the soul of our ranch, the creature we had raised together from a foal, the one thing that had bound us even when our marriage started to crack. And yet one evening as I walked into the stable, I found him restless, his ears flicking back, his body tensed. He stomped the ground as if he sensed something unnatural, something foreign. I ran my hand down his mane, whispering to him, but my gut was already twisted with an unshakable feeling. Something wasn't right, and then I saw it. The heel print in the hay. Not a boot print, not mine, not my husband's, not one of the stable hands. It was thin, delicate, and unmistakably a woman's high heel. A strange chill ran down my spine. My mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe a visitor, a ranch guest? But no one came into the stables this late. No one but us. I turned slowly, scanning the dimly lit barn. The air was thick with the scent of hay and earth, but beneath it there was something else, something faint, a floral perfume. My heart pounded. Who had been here? And more importantly, why? That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed beside my husband, his breath slow and steady, while my mind replayed every odd moment from the past few weeks. The sudden business trips, the urgent phone calls he'd take outside, the way he started coming home freshly showered, like he was rinsing away something or someone. And then there was Shadow. Our horse had seen something. The next morning I acted normal, made breakfast, kissed my husband goodbye, and then waited. The second his truck disappeared down the long road leading to town, I went back to the stables. This time I wasn't just looking, I was investigating. I moved past Shadow's stall into the storage area at the back, where we kept old saddles and feed supplies. And that's when I saw it. A scarf. A silk, perfume-scented scarf draped over the wooden railing, as if someone had forgotten it in a hurry. It wasn't mine, and it sure as hell didn't belong to any of our workers. I lifted it slowly, my fingers curling around the soft fabric. My stomach turned. I knew whose perfume this was. It belonged to her, the woman I had suspected for months, the woman my husband swore was just a friend, the woman who had no business being anywhere near our home, let alone in our stables behind closed doors, with my husband. A slow rage burned through me. I wasn't just betrayed, I was being made a fool of. And worse, he thought I wouldn't find out. He thought I was blind, he thought I was stupid. But he had forgotten something. Nothing stays a secret forever. Not in a small town, not in a marriage, and definitely not when your sins leave behind evidence. I wasn't going to scream, I wasn't going to cry. I was going to make him regret every single moment he thought he could deceive me. And the best part? I was going to use his own mistress to do it. I held the scarf tightly, my fingers digging into the silk as if I could crush the betrayal out of it. The smell of her perfume, sickly sweet and artificial, clung to my skin. She had been here, with him, in our stables, where we had built our dreams. But I didn't lose control. Not yet. I wasn't the kind of woman who flipped tables or screamed in the streets. Revenge, when done right, wasn't loud. It was slow. It was calculated. It was a storm you never saw coming until it swallowed you whole. I tucked the scarf into my pocket, took a deep breath, and walked out of the stables like nothing had happened. Because now I needed to watch, to listen, to be patient. And the moment he slipped up, I would be ready. That night I made dinner like I always did, set the table, poured his drink. When he walked through the door, looking relaxed, satisfied, oblivious, I almost laughed. "Hey, sweetheart," he greeted, leaning in to kiss me. I let him. I let his lips touch mine, though all I could taste was the lie. "How was your day?" I asked, my voice soft, curious, like I hadn't just found the evidence of his infidelity in our barn. "Same old," he said, rolling his shoulders. "Long day, I'm exhausted." Long day, exhausted. Right. I poured him another drink. "Oh, by the way," I said casually, setting the glass down in front of him, "I found something interesting in the stables today." His hand froze mid-reach, just for a fraction of a second. but I saw it. The stables? He echoed, trying to keep his voice light. I hummed, sitting across from him. Shadow was acting up again. You know how he gets when something's off? His jaw tightened. Bingo. What did you find? I tilted my head, pretending to think. Oh, just something unusual. A little out of place. I let the moment stretch just long enough for the tension to settle between us before I leaned in slightly. You wouldn't happen to know how a silk scarf ended up near the feed room, would you? His face drained of color so fast I thought he might pass out right there. A scarf? He repeated, clearing his throat. Well, maybe one of the stable hands. Oh, come on, honey, I laughed, shaking my head. You really think Hank or Tom are walking around in floral silk scarves? He had nothing to say to that. I watched him shift, the ice in his glass clinking as he suddenly seemed to need another sip. He was scrambling. Good. I stood up, taking my plate with me. Anyway, I said over my shoulder, my tone light, unaffected. I put it in your truck. Figured you might know who it belongs to. And with that, I left him sitting there, pale-faced and silent, as I walked into the kitchen. That night, he didn't sleep. I heard him get up twice, heard the quiet creak of the front door as he stepped outside, probably to check the truck, to make sure I hadn't done anything. Heard him sigh heavily, pacing, restless. Good. Let him sweat. Because this was only the beginning. I wasn't just going to catch him. I was going to ruin him. And the next time he snuck off to meet her, I would be watching. By morning, my husband looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. Dark circles under his eyes, his usual confident stride replaced by cautious hesitation. He knew I knew, but what he didn't know was how much. That was the fun part. I played my role perfectly, the oblivious, trusting wife. I kissed him on the cheek as I handed him his coffee. I hummed softly while making breakfast, stirring eggs like I didn't know he had spent half the night pacing. And then casually, as I slid a plate in front of him, I said, "You're heading into town today, right?" His shoulders stiffened, but he recovered quickly. "Yeah, got some errands to run." Errands. What a lovely word for adultery. I sipped my coffee, hiding my smirk. "Mind if I take your truck? Mine's acting up again." The way he nearly choked on his eggs was almost too much. Almost. My truck?" he stammered, grabbing his napkin and wiping his mouth like he suddenly couldn't breathe. "Why don't I just have Hank take a look at yours? No need for you to drive mine." There it was. The panic, the scrambling, the lies. I shrugged. "It's just a truck, sweetheart." Then leaning down, pressing my lips near his ear, I whispered, "Unless there's something inside it you don't want me to see?" I didn't wait for his answer. I simply straightened, grabbed my purse, and left. Of course, I had no intention of taking his truck. Instead, I waited, watched, and sure enough, an hour later, he left the house. Fast. I gave it 5 minutes, then grabbed my own keys and followed. The road stretched empty ahead, dust kicking up from his tires in the morning sun. He was in a hurry, desperate. I already knew where he was going, and I knew exactly who he was meeting. I parked a safe distance away from the small motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where secrets were exchanged in hushed tones behind cheap curtains. I watched as he stepped out of his truck, glancing around like a nervous criminal, like a man who had everything to lose. Then she appeared, dressed in tight jeans, her hair done like she had all the time in the world, her heels clicking against the pavement, the same heels I had seen prints of in our barn, the same perfume that had clung to that damn scarf. She wrapped her arms around him like she had every right to, like she wasn't walking into my life and taking pieces of it like a thief, and he let her. I should have been furious. I should have been heartbroken. But all I felt was a sick kind of satisfaction, because now I had everything I needed. I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and hit record. By the time I got back home, my husband was already there, sitting on the couch pretending like he hadn't just been in a motel room with another woman. I walked in, set my purse down, and met his gaze, and I smiled. "You got home fast," I said. He swallowed hard. "Yeah, didn't have much to do in town, Lieutenant." I sat down across from him, crossed my legs, and pulled out my phone. "You know, I was thinking," I mused, scrolling through my photos, We don't have enough pictures together. We should fix that. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. Yeah, sure. I turned my phone toward him, the screen lighting up with the image of him and her, tangled in each other, caught in broad daylight. His face went ghost white. Or, I continued, maybe I should just frame this one instead. Silence, heavy, suffocating. Then his voice, low, shaking. Where did you get that? I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hand. You know, sweetheart, Shadow always did have a way of sensing trouble. And this time, I smirked. He was right. His breath hitched. And that's when he knew. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was a warning, a storm he never saw coming. And I was just getting started. The color drained from his face as he stared at the screen, his hands gripping the armrest like the couch was the only thing keeping him from collapsing. Where did you get this? He asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I wanted him to sit in his own silence, in his own shame. Let him wonder how long I had known, how deep this went. Let him realize that the power had shifted. The man who once controlled everything, our ranch, our home, our life, was now sitting in front of me like a helpless child caught stealing. You were in town today, weren't you? I asked, watching his throat tighten. Running errands? He blinked rapidly, opening his mouth as if to speak, then closing it again. Good. Let him choke on his own excuses. I leaned back, setting my phone on the coffee table, letting the image sit there between us like an open wound. I thought you were exhausted last night, I mused. And yet, you somehow had the energy for this. His mouth pressed into a thin line. It's not what it looks like. I actually laughed at that, a sharp, bitter sound. Really? I tilted my head. Because to me, it looks exactly like what it is. You in a cheap motel with her. He clenched his jaw. I can explain. No, I said, my voice cold now. You can't. A heavy silence stretched between us. Finally, he ran a hand down his face, exhaling shakily. What do you want? And there it was. Not an apology, not regret, just damage control. I smiled slowly. I was waiting for you to ask. I stood up, pacing slowly, watching him sweat. You see, most women would scream, cry, throw things, beg their husbands to stay. I let my fingers glide across the back of the couch, circling him like a predator. But I'm not most women. He swallowed hard. I don't want revenge, I continued, stopping behind him, my voice near his ear. I want justice. He stiffened. What does that mean? I walked around him again, picking up my phone, flipping through more pictures. The motel wasn't the only place he had slipped up. I had weeks of proof, text messages, receipts, financial records. You didn't just cheat, darling, I said, feigning sympathy. You made mistakes. And now, you're going to pay for them. His breath hitched. You didn't just meet her in cheap motels, did you? I cut him off, watching his face twitch. No, you were generous. You gave her gifts, money, a house. His lips parted slightly. I smiled wider. Gotcha. You're wondering how I know, aren't you? I laughed softly. I'll tell you how, the same way I knew about the scarf in our barn, the same way I knew about the high-heel print near Shadow's stall. I leaned down, gripping the arms of the couch, my face inches from his. The same way I know everything. He inhaled sharply. I pulled back, standing tall. You moved money, sweetheart. Money that wasn't just yours. His face twisted. What? I held up my phone again, scrolling to an email. A forwarded transaction receipt, his mistress's name, a 5-figure deposit from our joint account. The realization hit him in waves. This, his voice was hoarse, this was your plan all along. I smiled. This was yours. I just cleaned up the mess. His hands curled into fists. You can't prove anything. Oh, honey. I let out a small chuckle, tilting my head. I don't have to. You already did. His eyes darted toward the door, as if planning his escape. But I wasn't finished, not yet. You think I'm going to divorce you and walk away with nothing? I asked, shaking my head. I want the house, The ranch. Everything. His nostrils flared. That's not happening. I stepped forward, lowering my voice. Then I'll make sure the right people see these records. He froze. The sheriff in town? He was my cousin, the lawyer handling our ranch contracts, my childhood best friend. I wasn't just a betrayed wife. I was someone who knew exactly where to hit. You wouldn't, he whispered, but the doubt was in his voice now. I crossed my arms. Try me. A long silence. Then finally his shoulders sagged. He knew he had lost. What do you want? He asked again, defeated. I smirked. I already told you. Everything. And if I agree? I leaned in, my voice low, firm. Then maybe, just maybe, I'll let you keep your name, your reputation. Maybe I won't drag you through the dirt like you did to me. His jaw ticked, but he nodded slowly, because he had no other choice. That night I sat on the porch, staring out at the land that was now legally mine. The sun had started to set, casting golden light across the fields. Shadows stood in the distance, grazing peacefully. He had sensed the storm before I had. And now, the storm was over. My husband? He was gone. And I was finally free. The silence in the house was deafening. For years, every creak in the floorboards had been filled with the sound of my husband's voice, the clinking of his whiskey glass, the distant hum of his phone buzzing with messages I had been too blind to question. But now it was just me, and I loved it. I sat on the couch, my legs curled beneath me, scrolling through the finalized legal papers. His signature was there, at the bottom of every document, just where I needed it to be. The house, the ranch, the assets, all mine. My husband, no, my ex-husband, had signed it all away. Of course, it hadn't been out of generosity, it had been out of fear. Fear of what would happen if I leaked the bank records. Fear of what would happen if the town found out how deeply he had betrayed not just me, but our business, our reputation, and the community that had once respected him. I had cornered him like a rat, and he knew it. But what he didn't know? I wasn't finished. The next morning I woke up early, stepping outside onto the porch, feeling the crisp morning air against my skin. Today was the day I put the final nail in his coffin. I walked to the barn, my boots crunching against the gravel. Shadow was already awake, his dark eyes watching me carefully. He had been my silent witness through it all, the first one to sense my husband's betrayal, the first one to warn me. I ran my fingers through his mane. You were right, boy, he huffed, nudging me gently, like he understood. Like he knew today was the day I truly ended this. I saddled him up and rode into town, taking the scenic route. The town was waking up, store owners opening their shops, locals gathering at the diner. I rode past the motel, the very place where my husband had sealed his own fate, and smirked. He had no idea what was coming. I stopped at the sheriff's office, tying Shadow outside. The sheriff, my cousin Ethan, was standing at his desk when I walked in. He looked up, surprised but curious. Well, if it isn't the most patient woman in town, he said, crossing his arms. I set the file down in front of him. What's this? He asked, raising a brow. I smiled. Proof. His expression turned serious as he flipped through the pages. Bank transactions, property transfers, money moving where it shouldn't have, a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to my ex-husband's fraud. Ethan let out a low whistle. Damn, you weren't playing around. I shook my head. Nope. He looked up at me. You want me to handle this quietly, or do you want him to burn? I didn't hesitate. I want the whole town to see what he did. Every single person, Ethan smirked. Consider it done. By noon, the town was buzzing. The sheriff's office had done its job. Word had spread like wildfire. I sat at the diner, sipping my coffee, pretending like I wasn't listening, as whispers filled the air. Did you hear? He was stealing from their own ranch fund. He gave her, his mistress, money from their business. And she caught him red-handed? Oh, Lord, I'd kill a man for less. They say he left town, humiliated, ain't ever coming back. I smiled into my coffee. Good. I didn't need revenge. I needed justice, and I got it. Because while my ex-husband might have thought he could take my home, my life, my trust, he had underestimated me. He thought he was the smart one, the one in control. But in the end, he was nothing more than a foolish man who sold his soul and his home for a cheap affair. And me, I had won. But there was still one more thing left to do. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden streaks across the ranch as I walked toward the barn. The air smelled of fresh hay and the crisp promise of a new beginning. The past few days had been a whirlwind, papers signed, truth exposed, and my husband's name dragged through the dirt he once believed he stood above. He was gone, for good. He had fled town the moment the news broke, leaving behind the remnants of a life he had ruined with his own greed and betrayal. No more stolen money, no more lies, no more mistresses sneaking into my home behind my back. And yet, I still felt the weight of it all. I stepped into the barn, and there was Shadow, waiting as if he had been expecting me. He flicked his tail, his big dark eyes watching me carefully, like he knew everything that had happened. Like he had seen the downfall of a man who thought he was untouchable. I smiled, running a hand down his mane. "It's just us now, boy." He nudged me gently and I laughed. "Yeah, I know. We deserve better." And better was exactly what I planned to get. The for sale sign stood at the end of the long dirt driveway, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. Not for my home, not for my ranch, for the house my ex had bought for his mistress, the one he had stolen from me, piece by piece with his lies. It wasn't hers anymore. The moment the truth came out, the bank had swooped in. Everything he had tried to keep hidden was now being picked apart by financial investigators, and his so-called mistress? She was left with nothing, just like she deserved. I leaned against the fence, watching as potential buyers pulled up to the property, the same house that had been meant to be a symbol of my downfall. But instead, it had become the final nail in my husband's coffin. I had won, in every way that mattered. A few weeks later, the divorce was finalized. My lawyer called me in to sign the last few documents, making everything official. When I stepped outside, I felt it, the weight lifting, the chains breaking, the final moment of freedom. I was no longer a woman defined by a man's betrayal. I was no longer the wife who had been cheated on, humiliated, lied to. I was simply me. And as I drove back to my ranch, back to the land that was mine and only mine, I knew one thing for certain. He had lost the best thing he ever had. And I had gained something far greater, a life without him.